thank you so much for joining us today. So I think I just will give you an introduction of what we're doing, and then we'll have a discussion. That's normally the more interesting part, the interaction. We started about 3 years ago with Global Footprint Network. We have worked about 15 years on the footprint, but just because it was getting very popular, and we said we needed to have a central organization to take on the message and standardize the way it's being used, and have as a very simple mission to end overshoot. Now, what's overshoot? That's the first question. Say, what do you want to end overshoot if you don't know what overshoot is? Essentially, the idea that we can use resources more rapidly than they regenerate. Like we can fish more rapidly than fish replace itself, or harvest more rapidly timber than timber regenerates. We can emit CO2 more rapidly than it's being absorbed by the biosphere. All that is what is called overshoot. So we would say climate change or fisheries collapses or deforestation, yes, we could call them problems, but actually they are more symptoms of this larger problem of overshoot. And now the point is not so much to lament about global decline, of all these ecosystems, but then translate that into something. What can we do about it? And that's where the footprint comes in, a way of measuring where we're at and to see whether we make progress towards where we need to go. Now, let me give you a quick overview of what I would like to cover in the talk, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. Essentially, I'll start from the big dream of humanity, sustainable development. What does that mean? How can we move forward from there? How does the footprint help us move in this direction? Looking at some applications, how to systemically address the issue of overshoot, and then how to scale up, because this is a race we want to win. Now, many of you may remember the concept of sustainable development, codified, you could say, in some ways for the first time globally through this report that is now nearly 20 years old, the Brundtland Report. How many of you have heard of the Brundtland Report? A few of you. Essentially, for the first time at the global level, the term sustainable development emerged as saying, we want to have good lives around the planet, and recognizing that just conventional development wouldn't make it because the planet is limited. Now, the concept has been used in many muddy ways, and people think, oh, it's actually not that specific. I would make the case it's the most specific policy concept around, much more than freedom, liberty, progress, wonderful concepts. But actually, sustainable development says, we want to have wonderful lives. Like development said, like this is kind of the big idea of the United Nations. We want to provide great lives for everybody around the world. That's kind of the driver. And so United Nations developed the Human Development Index, which is very materialistic. Essentially, it says people want to have long lives. I like to have a long life myself. People want to have access to education. Most of you have had access to education. I have had, so this is kind of, we like that. And the third one is we want to have some minimal income. Most people say actually maximum income. No, but some minimal income. And these three parameters then add up to what the United Nations calls Human Development Index. And 0.8 is what the United Nations calls high development. And I personally don't know anybody who wants voluntarily to live under 0.8. It's on average Mexico or Libya, that's about 0.8 for the average. So we can say, okay, we want to be on this side. That's what development is. Now, with sustainable development comes the recognition that there's another constraint. We only have one planet. Because if we didn't have one planet, if there weren't limits, then we should have accelerated development. There's so many people in the world that don't have enough. We did a big project in Africa where you see they really need more resources for having better lives. So how can we have development? That's really the question of sustainable development. How can we have development? How can we have great lives within the limits of the planet? Now, how do we know that? Very simply, and I will go into details, we can say the budget available per person of ecologically productive surfaces like forests, fisheries, cropland, grazing land, all added up, divided by the number of people on the planet, is, to use a metric number, 1.8 global hectares, or hectares. That's about 4.5 acres of space that is available on this planet. That's all there is. And then we can say, in order for development to be replicable worldwide, we need to be able to produce that on a budget average of less than 1.8 acres to provide all these resources, to provide the food, the fiber, and to absorb the waste. So that becomes kind of this line, the threshold. And we can say, wow, so actually we want to be on this side, and to make it replicable worldwide, we need to be under this line. So we can become very specific about sustainable development and say, that's where it has to happen. So we are calling for thinking inside the box, probably not a Google concept. But that's what we are trying to make as a point. How can we move in this direction? And various countries have different challenges. Just to show you some country names, probably not surprising, this distribution. Say, wow, that's a big challenge. Now you will say, but how do you actually know? How do we know how much there is and how much we use? Because yes, Human Development Index, that's done by the United Nations. They're reliable. But who are you? So essentially, our DNA, so to say, is this research question. We say, without this research question, we cannot move sustainability forwards. And that's what we're committed to. We're saying, we need to know how much of the biosphere's regenerative capacity is used by human activity. Is the human enterprise getting bigger than what the biosphere can regenerate? And then who has access to which part? And that's what we're trying to answer with the ecological footprint. Now, is it a good answer? Possibly not the best answer possible, but it's the best answer available at this point, we would say. And essentially, it starts from looking at the world through a lens of metabolism. Like I have metabolism, we eat, and that keeps us alive. An economy has a metabolism. And the question, like for the cow, is how many resources are necessary to maintain the cow? How much pasture is necessary to maintain the cow? How much ecological capacity is necessary to maintain a city, a country, or myself? That's what we're trying to measure. That's an accounting of how much do we have in terms of nature's capacity, how much do we use in terms of metabolism to maintain ourselves. Okay, let's look at how much we have available, our ecological supply. Essentially, very simply, one planet that is covered by productive ecosystems, and the productive, exploitable ecosystems cover about 1/4 of the surface of the planet. And if you remember from geography, the metric system was devised, was built on the size of the planet. The French 200 years ago said, let's define the kilometer as the 40,000th piece of the equator. They didn't get it fully right, but 200 years ago, they measured it without satellites. They got it more or less right. And that's how the kilometer was defined. And so you can calculate the surface yourself, with the PR square thingy, remember? And take about 1/4, look at maps, what is productive, not the Sahara, not Antarctica, but the productive area is 1/4. And then you get, with the current population of we are about 6.5 billion people now, 6.2 in 2002. If you divide that, you get about 1.8 hectares of ecologically productive space. A hectare is about the size of a soccer field. It's kind of very culturally specific because I think a football field is about 1 acre and the soccer field is about 1 hectare. So I don't know if that's very meaningful, but anyhow, so about 4.5 acres of capacity. And then some of you will remember, you have a few non-human species here around too. I just saw the dinosaur out there, so remember, there are some other species as well that would need some space with whom we compete. These seals are eating our fish, How much of our fish do we want to give to the seals? So the question is, how much do we want to leave for other species? The wild species are in competition with us. E.O. Wilson, who brought the biodiversity idea into the public mindset and in the academic debate, he thinks that about half of the biocapacity should be set aside for other species in order to maintain one of our biggest assets, biodiversity. And he's very committed to quality of life, but that would mean if we follow his advice, our budget would shrink from 1.8 hectares on average worldwide as an average budget to 0.9. And the big question really is, I think that's the research question of this century. How can we all live well within perhaps 1 hectare per person? And we don't know. And we say, rocket science, that's really hard. Now I would say, done. We know how to fly to the moon. Do we know how to live on this planet? We don't know that yet. That's the big challenge of this century. Now, what's the demand side? That's a bit more difficult because my footprint is spread around the globe. So I don't have just one farm supporting me, but there are little bits of farms, like from Colombia, coffee, perhaps, or from the Midwest, potatoes, and cereals. So they're all different pieces that are competing for space, for food, fiber, waste absorption, urban space. You all add it up around the globe, you get one footprint. We can go into details if you want discussion or how do we exactly calculate it, but it's very simple. I mean, you think about, I like to eat, for example, 10 pounds of tomatoes a year, or whatever it is. Now, how much air is necessary to produce 10 pounds of tomatoes? Very straightforward. Same with sheep. I like to eat so much sheep. How much air is necessary to produce that much sheep meat, for example? So just add it up, all competing areas. We have about 5,000 data points per country and year that we use from United Nations statistics. And just do this balance, like tomatoes. How many are being produced? How many are exported? How many are imported? That's the net consumption of the United States. How many potatoes? How many cereals? How much cotton, etc. All added up. And then we can make the balance at the global level as well by adding up all the countries to one big calculation. And then we get this summary. As we said, in total, using about 1.8, having about 1.8 hectares available, and some of it we may want to leave for other species, we say, and then we look at how much we use and say, wow, this guy should go into real estate. He can make area out of nothing. How can we use more than what we have? How can we spend more money than we earn? Pretty simple, for some. So like we can cut trees at twice the rate that they regenerate. That would be the footprint of the products would be double as big as the area of the forest. Does that make sense? So that the overshoot would be factor 2, so it would be twice as big. Globally, we see now an overshoot of about 25%, or it takes a year and 3 months to regenerate what we use within 1 year. We can look at the ratio. I was born 62, so we used about half the planet. By now, we use 1.25 planets, so it's a rapid increase. And we'd say, yeah, but hasn't technology changed? Yeah, technology has changed. So it's the ratio we're looking at. Number of planets has stayed constant. It's a different planet every year. And we see actually a change in technology that has shifted the balance, but not fast enough. So we haven't been able to make the Earth more rapidly productive than we are using resources. So we're outstripping the ability of nature to regenerate itself. We're working with various agencies. For example, the European Environment Agency sponsored our updates last year. We're working with WWF, with the Living Planet report. I have a few here if you're interested. We just had it launched in October. We do local reports here for Europe, where Barroso, who is the president of the European Union, he presides over 450 million people, wrote the foreword. And very interestingly, he said, we have to respect the limits of the planet's natural resources. And that in a report where we showed that in 1961, Europe used about 1 Europe. So per capita, we see how much was the footprint by capacity. Now, Europe uses about 2.5 Europes. So he said, yeah, ecological capacity matters. It's actually not just a moral issue. It's a risk issue. Countries are starting to get exposed by having a deficit. Where does the difference come from? Either from liquidating your own assets, and Europe doesn't do it that much because they have the money to buy it from somewhere else, or by importing the difference from somewhere else. Now, the interesting part, how can that be used, looking into the future? And what we did is looking at the ratio again from 1960 to 2000 to say, how much have we used in the past? That's the past. That's where I was born. I got a son, 2001. And the question is, how many planets will we use when he's my age? And then we took the most conservative United Nations projections. Not the most extreme, the most conservative. Very slow population growth, the moderate population growth rates. The IPCC, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenario, the most moderate CO2 scenario, most moderate, and not even assuming that much biomass would be used. Very aggressive agricultural increase of productivity. And still, adding this all up, doing as if the various United Nations agencies talk together, the overall scenario that is coming out would tell us we would use about twice the capacity of the planet by then. Now, that's kind of the crazy thing. In the past, visionaries would go far beyond what was necessary. Today, we're in a situation where our collective vision doesn't meet even what is necessary. It's pretty striking, I would say. So we say, actually, probably may want to move out of overshoot. Probably that's a good idea. That probably pays off. And now the problem is, there was an interesting study done by conservation, by BirdLife International. They looked at what's the value created through old-fashioned conservation. You invest in birds. $1 invested into birds. How much value is being generated? They said roughly about $100 of value is generated. And you say, why are banks not running to that opportunity? $1 invested, $100 back. I mean, who can resist? The reason is that the $100 they get diffused into the whole world. Everybody will profit from the $100, but the investor won't. So that's what holds us back from investing into the future, where actually there would be very good returns, we believe, overall. Now, what happens if we actually stay on that track? Like with money, we can talk about deficit and debt that accumulates to a debt. We can do that ecologically. So the deficit has been growing, as you can see. That's now the 1.2 planets. And then, if we continue on that track, the accumulated debt, so the area under the curve, so to say, for those who have taken calculus and have survived, it's about 35 planet years worth of production, 35 years of production necessary to rebuild that stock that we would deplete. Is that possible physically? I mean, a forest has about 50 years worth of stock when it's totally mature, and then you can cut it in 1 year. But then what? So is that globally possible to deplete? Is there enough stock available to deplete for that track? And then when we get up there, what will happen? We believe that's pushing it. We think moving out of overshoot is much more productive for us. So really that shifts the balance for the future. I think one of the most destructive concepts of the 20th century that is still in our minds is to divide the world by saying there are developing countries and developed countries. Have you heard of this distinction? Developed countries and developing countries. Now, if everybody worldwide would live Western European lifestyles, let's just take one example, it would take about 3 planets. So it's just at the current population levels. It would be like probably 50% more people by 2050. So it's a dream that is not possible. So rather, I think the future will be dividing itself. And that's not about fair or unfair, just about describing what it is between ecological debtors and ecological creditors. Meaning, who is using more resources for their consumption than they have available in their country, and who is not. So Switzerland, where I'm from, we use about 3 times more capacity than we have available in Switzerland. Wow, that's, but we are rich. We can buy the difference. Egypt has about the same ratio, just more difficult for them. So, but for all of them, it's becoming an increasing liability. So it's a risk exposure that we're not aware of. And I would say like the risk of ecological collapse, failing states, as they say in the defense community, for example. How many failing states does it take until the dollar starts to fail in some way? Enormous risk. We see that like Haiti, I'll be talking more about it. Rwanda, we see that happen. They just don't have much value on the Wall Street market, but that's what is happening. So it's not about, is it possible to collapse? Actually, historically, we have seen many examples. I don't know if you know about Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. But we see it now already in certain states happening. And it's avoidable. But if we don't give attention, then the number of lives lost, the immediacy of it, and the probability of it occurring is much higher than many other risks that we are looking at. Now we can do maps. We can look at where's the footprint happening. You can see what has happened. We actually have a movie on our website that looks at 40 years of history, how the intensity of the footprint has increased. Essentially, this is a map of where you want to buy where you want to put your shopping markets. The darker it gets, that's where you want to put the next malls. And you can see Europe hasn't really shifted that much because it was already dense and high footprint. And then you see the emerging markets, China and India, with large populations, not so high footprint, but it's adding up as well. Now, we've just started with a project on Africa, because if you look at the human development debate or international development debate, Millennium Development Goals, beautiful ideas, but devoid of the idea that there are ecological limits. And that's kind of surprising, because when you look at how countries are moving, what you see is, and any farmer would know that, is that our ecological capacity is starting to constrain countries' ability to consume resources. So like in Rwanda, they would love to have larger footprints. But their biocapacity, which is in green, their biocapacity has been declining to a large extent because of population increase. And so the footprint has kind of moved down with it at the same rate. And then they had a war, and then you see biocapacity declining more rapidly because they couldn't attend their areas very well. And then they were able to extend the footprint a bit beyond biocapacity for some time. This whole difference is food aid. So, wow, you can actually show, even with bad data sets from Africa, we can show what any farmer would know, If once you use the whole farm, that's it, And then Senegal, a similar situation. Lost biocapacity per capita, and as they started to hit it, they started to get more constrained, and the wiggles of the biocapacity start to translate directly into footprint. And that's like a death and life situation for people who are just that's less or more food. So we can make this connection very directly. Or another example of collapse, just tracing history. North Korea was able to increase their footprint pretty rapidly because of help from the Soviet Union and China. When the Soviet Union collapsed, China also was floundering a little bit because of the resource shift. North Korea wasn't able to get the energy from the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, wasn't able to get the rice from China. Their footprint collapsed dramatically. Actually, even worse, their biocapacity as well. They didn't have the energy to run their tractors and fertilizers, and I'll just get to, and as a result, that contraction led to, some people say, up to 2 million people dying. Now, there's just a description of what it is, not saying that's ideal. Yeah.
I guess that answers my question. I was wondering how HDI tracks biocapacity and footprint.
We don't have good HDIs on North Korea because it's a pretty closed country, and people don't even know how many.
I was wondering for any of the African countries if you have.
Yeah, I do have. Yeah.
Okay, does it track the biocapacity
In some areas it does. In some areas we have had some more rapid decline. For example, South Africa, we had a reversal of the HDI to a large extent because of the HIV crisis. But very much, you see kind of the constraints that those countries that have more capacity left, that just have more leeway to move around than others, they go into warfare, or, like Darfur is another example. We can't track Darfur because it's a sub-national region, but that's what's happening at the regional scale. Lack of resources leading to conflicts and pretty miserable lives, yeah. Okay, so just two insights. Biocapacity constraints. Biocapacity can constrain countries, particularly low-income countries, and those first. But it's basically, what any farmer would know, but just is absent from the current debate. So we do as if we were limitless in our resources. And we see already that swings, which will be getting bigger for countries that are in arid areas in Africa, in the biocapacity. Dry years will reduce the biocapacity, will directly translate into lower footprints, which is not a nice thing. Many people in the world are actually reducing their footprint, not because they want to, because they're forced into lower footprints. And that's what we absolutely want to avoid. Our commitment is to best quality of life, not to smaller footprints. It's just that there's only so much budget. Now let me get to two major conclusions. One is, you say, very self-serving. What does that mean for policymakers, for example, or for us? One is, we need good measurement tools that focus on the things that really matter. And sustainability is impossible without looking at how much capacity we have compared to how much we use. While it's sometimes resisted, resistance doesn't make limits go away. Some people say, I go hiking, oh, I hate gravity. Say, thank you for sharing. I hate ecological limits. Here are tools that you can live with it. It's just what it is. So what do comprehensive measures help you? We call it the bed cover effect. If you have a cold night, you have a cold head, you want to cover your head, but the cover is a bit small, you get cold feet. We like redwoods in California, don't we? Let's buy more Indonesian timber and not cut down our redwoods. or we don't want to emit so much CO2. Let's put biodiesel into diesel, you know? Now, in Europe, they have to put 5.75% of biodiesel into diesel as a first step towards moving out of carbon. That sounds like nothing. BP said, we don't want to get into palm oil for supplementing these 5.75%, you know? Because palm oil, essentially it destroys tropical rainforests. And the last orangutans, do I say that right? Orangutans? How does it, you know what I mean? Monkeys? Yeah. Essentially, they will be killed by palm oil plantations, I think. Now, BP is not able to get enough non-palm oil biofuel just for the 5.75% diesel in Europe. So they say, wow, are we just trashing the rest of the biosphere by kind of trying to get better on another side? We have to look at the whole budget. Are we staying within budget? The second thing is slow things first. What do we mean by that? Many people talk about low-hanging fruit. We should do things that are easy and give a good return first. We would say, not a bad idea, but even better is to think of the slow stocks. Because when we look at the curve again, how quickly we move into overshoot, what we will see is that that's a very short time frame compared to stocks we put in place today. What do I mean by stocks? Dams, roads, power plants, people born today, hopefully living 75 years. These stocks put in place today will determine consumption patterns for decades to come. And at the same time, we need to do radical shifts. So we need to get the stocks right now. We need to get the stocks right today. So any house built today that isn't up to the highest green standards is essentially a liability, a trap for the future. Or building more kind of just road infrastructure for cars possibly will detract us from being able to live well within our means. So it's not just about being nice to the poor Africans. It's actually being nice to ourselves. Are we building future-friendly infrastructures ourselves that are able to support us in the future? Now, by having clarity about what we need to get towards, I think Paul Hawken said we are very good at reaching goals, but not very good at setting goals. You know? So we need to be clear, what's actually the goal we're trying to achieve? And by being able to have these measures, and we have seen that in Australia quite dramatically by billion-dollar projects now, using this innovation to reduce their footprint. Innovation is probably the biggest resource we have to move in that right direction. What kinds of innovations? I mean, it starts with good accounting is one innovation. Making it accessible. I don't know if you have seen, do you know Gapminder? Have you seen gapminder.org? Yeah. Like, for example, how to make graphs, and I think Google has done it too, graphs visible to people to understand. Or if you look at this little graph that I showed in the beginning, to make that accessible to people and say, wow, we can make that dynamic. How have dots moved over time? How has this square shrunk over time? So start people explore what are the possibilities, or looking at scenarios, helping people to play God and say, what kind of parameters can we choose to move us out of overshoot? You know? So you can start to play. What changes if fertility rates change, if consumption rates change? So you can start to see, kind of, do we shoot into space, or can we kind of land the plane again? Very essential. That's really where I think we need to move forward through it. Now, in terms of adoption, you can say, is that just a pie in the sky dream? You know, are we able to actually make a difference in the world? We are playing that we believe we want to win. We want to get out of overshoot. Are we doing it right? Such a small organization. Unfortunately, fortunately, we are starting to play with bigger and bigger players. I think it's the biggest game in town in some ways, being able to get out of overshoot. And we see the typical innovation curve that in the beginning, we were in the dark ages for a long time, people resisting it. And there's still some resistance, which we are engaging with. And then people who start to understand the challenge, they engage with us, they talk with us, even statistical offices. People who start to accept the idea, accepting meaning they see, yeah, it's in our interest to look at the world from a biophysical perspective. WWF, for example, which spends about $600 million a year, the largest conservation organization worldwide, are now using the footprint as their organizing principle for their whole programming. At the beginning, it was just kind of a weird idea. Now, with the Living Planet reports, it has become so central to their being that they say, wow, we cannot save pandas without reducing human pressure. But we cannot reduce human pressure without doing it in fair ways, otherwise we just have more conflicts. So sustainability becomes central to their operation. Financial institutions starting to see, we need to understand who are the winners and losers in the future. So whether we are interested in sustainability or not doesn't really matter, but it's better information to understand future performance. And then obviously people are already adopting it, billion-dollar projects who are reducing the ecological footprint. So our lens is very simple. As a symbolic goal, we say we want to have 10 nations to adopt the footprint like GDP within 10 years. So we call it 10 in 10. Why? Because once you put something on the agenda, it gets attention. Once countries start to sweat as much about their unemployment rate and about their ecological deficit as a risk exposure, then we'll start to see traction. And in order to make that happen, a lot of other things need to be in place. We have to be able to have successful business examples. We have to have excellent engagement tools with the public. We have to have academic fora to engage with. But that's kind of the symbolic outcome. Are we able to engage countries? And these are the countries where we have now about 30 countries on the hot list. The red ones, Switzerland, Japan, have already done reviews of the calculations to see, is that really solid information? Actually, Japan, we're just starting with them. The orange one are the hotter ones. Australia is a hot country just because of climate, but just more interested. And then the yellow ones is where we have pretty good leads, and we could move it forward with more capacity. So North and South, as you can see, has shown interest. It's not just a northern tool imposed colonially onto the South and say, you shouldn't consume because we have consumed, but you shouldn't follow us, but we won't change our lifestyle. It's not about that. It's basically just saying, hey, there's so much budget. You choose what is in it for you. And for all of them, they start to recognize biocapacity matters. If you don't manage it well, we'll be essentially undermining ourselves. So with that, I would like to come to an end with the just direct presentation. We have some few little gifts for you. We call it the new Swiss pocket knife. It's actually my wife's joke. She says, this is like compared to the Swiss pocket knife. Swiss pocket knife cuts through Swiss cheese, but this one cuts through bologna. So you can take a few with you. We also say it's like a credit card because it has the same size, You can carry it with you, and it's so interesting. You can show it to friends, and they say, wow, you're so interesting. I want to invite you over for dinner. So some economists say there's no free lunch. And they may be right. But with this one, there are free dinners. So perhaps not so attractive to Google because you have good lunches here as well. So it's probably not so much of an advantage. But perhaps you can get an interesting hike, or I don't know, or an interesting date. Who knows? And then we have also a little video that summarizes what it's all about. And some of these living plan reports, this has been the most successful report in WWF history. They're 50 years old now soon. And basically summarizing the overall ecological challenges with the ecological footprint. Picked up about 700 news stories, according to Google. That's what we used, of course, to track the news stories. And the way to engage, perhaps the last thing I want to say, in terms of innovation, we're trying to basically generate critical mass. One interesting thing that perhaps Google may be interested in engaging is to say, the Olympic Games, Beijing, Vancouver, Winter Games, London, they're talking about one planet Olympics. How can we have footprint neutral Olympics? Because we love the Olympics, but they take a lot of resources. And the idea would be to engage in a calculator project where people can calculate their footprint and find out how they can reduce their footprint and then pledge that difference to the Olympic Games. So to see if people can pledge enough footprint reductions to make the footprint at the Olympics footprint neutral. And why that would be interesting is that it's kind of just a time-limited thing. It's a competitive thing. Which nation would get the gold medal in reducing their footprint most per capita, for example? You can make it interactive and just get this message out in a playful way rather than being party pooper and say, these bad Olympics, they use so many resources. No, we like the Olympics, but we can do it together in a way that actually humanity's footprint will decrease. So it's truly kind of a competitive spirit for the one planet we live on. So these kind of ideas, how to apply these data sets in ways to engage with people in constructive ways. Yes?
My suggestion.
Thank you. a suggestion.
I think people are fundamentally selfish.
Absolutely.
And not constructive. But I think you can still get them to compete. If you can point out to them that the result of reducing their footprint relative to their economic peers has the aggregate effect over their entire economy of raising their GDP. Because if your footprint goes down, everything's effectively cheaper for you.
Yeah.
And if you can make that case, I think it's a stronger case that it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
I mean, as soon as you walk into the room and you start making a moral argument on something that's a resource allocation financial question, I think you're going to lose.
I couldn't agree more with you, and I would repeat the comment so people can hear it. You're saying, I don't know your name. Crutcher says, essentially people are selfish, and so it has to be in their self-interest to reduce their footprint. Otherwise, if it's just a moral argument, they will just resist it. And I couldn't agree more. And I think we had very poor messaging in the beginning. I remember we had a campaign at the very beginning that was paid by, how was it? It was Ontario Hydro. Ontario Hydro made this campaign. They gave us these buttons. It said, reduce your ecological footprint. And everybody was wearing it with pride. And I then went to Chile to a lecture. And at the end of the lecture, brilliant little student in the end, she said, hey, why should I reduce my footprint so that you can eat more chocolate? Very good, I think. So what's in it for them? And that's exactly, actually, now our commitment is not to reducing footprint primarily. Our commitment is to quality of life. And so when we are working, for example, in the African context, we are helping people. How can you secure your quality of life? If you understand the global context, you can act much better. For example, we hope to do a project soon with Mozambique. They have quite a bit of ecological reserve. And so the question for them is not so much say how to reduce their footprint, but say how can you take advantage of your competitive advantage in a world where resources are getting increasingly scarce. In the past, for example, Enron wanted to buy all their gas reserves and sell them to Europe because they knew about the Kyoto market. You know? But luckily, Enron collapsed before, so that didn't happen. But that basically would have produced very little value for Mozambique, for a resource that gets increasingly more valuable. So then one implication would be focus on short-term resource contracts rather than long-term resource contracts, so you can kind of increase your price for your resource as you move along and the world is shifting. So absolutely, that's what we're looking for. How can this be in the self-interest of a city, of a business, of an individual? And that's what we are finding with these applications, absolutely. So let's have two questions in the back, and then move over to you. Yes? Yes.
So I want to play devil's advocate for a second, and someone might say, like, you know, the resources we have available are not necessarily fixed, because like you have these are only 7% of the oceans are like available, or like 11% of deserts and so on.
Very good, yeah.
Right. So and of course there are the efficiencies in production or whatever in utilizing the existing resources. So I mean, of course, it's good to slow down like the footprint and stuff, but what about like increasing available resources?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely. So the question is, obviously technology has changed and we can also increase supply. And that's absolutely the case. Absolutely the case. So we're looking at both sides, not just how much we use, but how much is available. There's always the ratio between the two. And when we actually look at to what extent have we been able to increase the productivity of the planet, we see about, on average, a 15% increase across the board. So agricultural, like the Green Revolution, has been a huge driver. Now that comes with other costs. For example, you need more fossil fuel to make that happen, or it may not be less biodiversity friendly, etc. But we have seen a quite significant increase, just that the increase hasn't been as rapid as the increase of demand. But we're saying there are 5 factors that you can look at. On the supply side, how much area is productive, that we can, and how productive is it per hectare. And then on the demand side, essentially, it's how many people times how much do they consume per person, and how efficiently is what they consume being produced. So all 5 factors play a role, and these are all the factors to look at. So
suggestions could, like, I mean, in the steps that we take, I didn't see any suggestions for improving the, like, getting more out of the resources, but like I saw only things to reduce like the consumption.
Yeah, actually, I think all 5 need to be addressed massively, massively. And I see some bonanzas, actually. I mean, in the efficiency side, there are some bonanzas to take advantage of. However, we have to be careful that efficiency gains are not just used to consume more. That's what happened. Like, for example, airplanes. I think the first jumbo jet, I don't know the exact numbers, but the first jumbo jet was perhaps half as efficient as the newest ones, which means we just now fly further because we don't have to stop in between, so we can have direct flights to Australia, for example. So we have to be careful of the rebound effect. I think one of the big bonanzas is demographics. It's a very hard topic to talk about because people react, but actually it's the most women, child, and environment-friendly policy that opens up new opportunities for a vast amount of populations. If you can't turn that around fast enough, a lot of suffering will be coming onto the poorest, not onto rich people. So anyhow, yeah, so all factors need to be addressed. In the back, and then, yeah.
2 questions.
Yeah.
One, there seems to be a single country inside the box in Latin America. What country is that?
In the box?
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, if you study this card, then you can find out. And I'm not allowed to say. I'm not allowed to say it within this country. And again, the square doesn't mean it's individually desirable. It's just a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition, and yeah.
Here it's only marked as part of the wall, but not a
Yeah, you can look at on the other side. It shows the HDI and the footprint. So you can go which country has about a footprint under the black line, and a HDI that is over 0.8, and then you go Costa Rica 0.83. Oh no, its footprint is too big. Let's go down.
Okay, I'll do my homework. And my second question is that you just mentioned demographics at the very end. Why is it so taboo to talk about reduction in population? So it's not so taboo to talk about population control, but probably there is only one country that sets goals that can potentially lead to reduction, and that is China. Everybody else tries to best maintain their population.
It's a very interesting question you're raising. Why is the demographic side so taboo? As I said, I think that the biggest bonanza we can get is out of demographics. I believe, and there's a very strong economic case to be made, that shrinking industrial populations will be more competitive than growing industrial populations. And we can go into that detail, but demographers haven't understood that yet, and that's one of it's a big absurdity that we haven't understood that yet. And then I think it's such a sensitive issue, and I think so many things have been done wrong in the past. I mean, for example, in India, they were kind of like enforced sterilization or population control, that there were like implants, like against the knowledge of the women, they were made infertile and things like that. So it has been seen as anti-feminist, against human rights. I mean, there's so many, or religious feelings. So I think the messaging around population has been just extremely poor, and it's still such a liability that nobody wants to touch the topic. And so it's just left to those who are kind of more insensitive to the issue, and then all the discussion we hear about demographics gets people's hair kind of stand up, and then we say, oh, let's not touch that topic because it's too difficult to touch it, because it won't affect my well-being. It's easy to keep it a taboo, but the suffering it will produce is enormous. If we compare India and China, I think it's quite interesting. China chose to slow down its population growth. And I think as a result, I don't have full evidence, but as a result, it has been much more able to fight poverty. It's the most successful country in fighting poverty. It has been able to increase its economic productivity enormously. As a country that doesn't even speak English, like India would be so much better positioned with its great educational institutions, its English language, to be much more integrated in the global economy. And some pockets of India are. But China, with the incredible language barrier, with the systems barrier of kind of a communist country, has been able to turn things around much more effectively. And I think demographics has a lot to do with it, as an example. Yeah. So demographics is really important. Then you had a question, and then you're in the red. Mm-hmm.
So going back to your graph with the dots, there seems to be a fairly strong correlation between the Human Development Index and the footprint.
Yeah.
What's the causality there? Is that you're more developed, you consume more, or is it the other way around?
Yeah. Okay, so is there a correlation between HDI and footprint? I think you can look at in two ways at the graph. One is to say, what's the underlying pattern? And then the other question is, why are there deviants? And I think the deviance question is more interesting because what is actually the range of possibility? And if you go and look at subnational level, you see even bigger differences. One of the interesting stories is, for example, Kerala in the south of India, about as big in population as California. And they have been able to achieve longevity like industrialized countries and low child mortality and female participation and replacement fertility and industrial suicide rates too. So all the industrial diseases they have inherited as well on $1 a day. Very high literacy rate. Free education till second year of college. Now they got so successful that they're now working in the Middle East and bring a lot of money back, and that's kind of screwing up the economy. But in some ways, so you can actually achieve a very high quality of life and longevity and also population health on very little resources. So that's possible. Now, generally, we have seen that increase in economic activity goes hand in hand with increase in resource use. Which I understand. That's why I say being in this square individually may not be the fullest, most desirable situation. It's just something we need to do globally if we don't want to liquidate our planet. So, yes, in red you were next, and then we have, or you're first. Sorry. Very good. Thank you. That's very generous.
Is there any business model to the global footprint network? Can I talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. We are a non-profit organization, but to a large extent driven by fee-for-service projects. So we have a very large percent of fee-for-service projects, like, for example, producing a living plan report, or doing a study for the European Environment Agency, or working with the Swiss USAID, so the Swiss SDC they're called, to work with African, it's called SDC, it's the Development Agency of Switzerland. Yeah. So these are examples of projects that are totally mission-driven, but people want the result, and we love those because people then want the product. If you just get a grant and then do something, there's no public there. Then you produce something, doesn't even reach the shelf. It just reaches your own shelf in your office, and then you have boxes of reports nobody wants. So the business model is really important in order to move forward. We also have income from our partner organizations to help with kind of public goods initiatives like standardization, maintenance of our national accounts, increasing support from foundations for these kind of initiatives, the strategic initiatives that don't have a clear product for one particular client. Is that what and then we are working with a lot of businesses. And actually, the way we work with businesses is we don't go to them to say, hey, reduce your footprint. We actually turn it the other way around. We say, it's perhaps a very American way of saying it, but we say, we help the good guys. We help the good guys get a bigger piece of a shrinking pie. So we want the good guys to outcrowd the bad guys. And in the process, not reduce their footprint. Actually, they should be more successful and outcrowd the bad guys. So we want to help the conversation of ecological limits be successful for those who take it on. Probably the first thing has to be breaking the taboo about ecological limits. And once that people see that as in their advantage, so who is winning from that conversation? People in the finance industry recognize if we don't take these risks seriously, we put our investments in jeopardy. Particularly long-term investments, stocks that are badly invested will actually lose out. Under-investing in green buildings will be losing out, for example. Or who are other winners? People who in the defense industry think, where are conflicts emerging? People who say, we are really serious about human development. In Africa, if we don't look at ecological constraints, we're just helping a family to survive another 2 years, but not systemically turn things around or kind of help one region at the cost of another. So we need these kind of tools to succeed. And that's the people we work with. So we always go with the wind. There's a lot of wind in the world rather than trying to do uphill battles against people who don't want to engage. So you in the red were next, and then you, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that public health is sort of at odds with productivity, and it seems like a lot of ways to reduce your ecological footprint would reduce public health. Like, for example, I think organic growing typically uses more land than non-organic growing. And I wonder what your thoughts are on where to draw the line about what's healthy enough and what is small footprint.
There are various budget constraints that we have to look at. One is financial budget constraints. We have only so much money, and that's what we have to live in. We only have so much ecological capacity that we have to live in. Some people say organic farming would use more resources per carrot produced, for example, than non-organic. That's interesting to look at. I think that the debate is not conclusive on that one. But on the other hand, I mean, organic agriculture can maintain productivity much longer. So these are the hard questions we have to look at. Are we just in such a dire situation that we need to use all the industrial agriculture we can get just to get by and feed people, or can we actually think a little bit more long term? And often we trade off the short term against the long term. We don't understand the costs. But we can think differently. People always tell me, politicians cannot deal with these issues. They only think 3 months ahead because of the next election or whatever, or 4 years ahead if the election is far ahead. And I think that's not true. Politicians help fund public projects like bridges. And if a bridge collapses 3 years after it's built, it's really bad for them and their whole party. So they in some areas, they can actually think very long term. But not for sustainability yet. So we haven't been able to make the case that in the same way we can calculate, is a city future friendly? Are you building a trap for your constituency? Or are you really building something that will operate in the long run? So we have to look at these trade-offs, and that sometimes there may be hard choices, but by making that clear. So sustainable development is a trade-off between saying, why there's only one planet and we all want to live well. How can we combine them? And by understanding the potential trade-offs, we can overcome them. By ignoring them, we just kind of stay on business as usual and get into more and more difficult territory. Yes, you were next, and then, actually I said you would be next and then you. Is that okay? So, yeah.
I'm just wondering if there are any companies that are using a smaller ecological footprint as advertising or promotions.
I just saw a bumper sticker today, offset your footprint. Oh, interesting. Who is that? Carbonfund.org or something? So yes, it's being used quite a lot. BP had, I think, a multi-million-dollar advertisement campaign, and we didn't get $1 from it, but we're grateful that's done. Where they said, reduce your carbon footprint. So,
what are they actually tabulating, saying, if you buy gas from us, your ecological footprint is 10% lower than if you buy.
We are working with a number of companies. The one is an electricity company, BC Hydro. They want to increase their production of electricity, but at no net increase in footprint, for example. So they use that as an internal number. We have worked with a waste company in France to look at the footprint of waste disposal and waste management, saying, wow, waste disposal is not just a cost, it's an investment in being able to recuperate ecological values out of the waste stream. So they're starting to think about the whole metabolism, so they're becoming managers of the metabolism. We have worked with green building initiatives, to say how much can be reduced. There's an interesting example, Bed Z in the UK, where the architect said, we want to live on one planet. What would it take? And they did a social housing project on a small footprint, and afterwards measured how close did we get. And I think more important is not just to say, we are better than you, we are saints, but saying we are honest, We tried, we failed, that's why we failed, and that's how we make it better in the future. So honesty, I think, beats performance from my perspective. And the honesty is about the honesty of recognizing there's one planet, and what does that mean? How close are we getting to this goal? Does that answer your question? We have some more business case studies if you want to look at, but every business uses it slightly differently. We could use labels, for example, but that's another, people have had this idea, hasn't happened yet, maybe a possibility. Yeah.
2 questions on the demand side.
Yeah.
And you tell me if they're related. Mm-hmm. First of all, what's behind this explosive demand growth shown on the red,
Yeah.
And why is the UAE, how come the UAE is the highest demand?
We always laugh at Dubai because they have ski slopes in the middle of the hottest desert. We don't laugh as much at Las Vegas, which is about the same thing. There are Las Vegases around the world. People are wealthy and they can just build whatever they want. So I think Dubai is as legitimate in building ski slopes as Las Vegas is to build water oases. So just energy is cheap, so they cool down their cows. And
So it's an energy thing.
energy is a big part of it, and wealth leads to being able to purchase things from other places.
So you say the growth is...
And the growth here, to a large extent, it's also driven. Population is a big driver. It's everything we want to consume. Or actually, here we look at not so much increase in energy. It's basically flat per capita consumption nearly, and population is still increasing. So you can't say it's population, it's just that happens to correlate in similar amounts that per capita we're not increasing that much of footprint. Because of efficiency gains, so we may be able to get a little bit more. Yeah. So that's why we think, I mean, the measurement is really important. What would it cost to put GDP into 10 countries? And I think with 10 countries we'll have critical mass. And once this is on people's kind of radar screen, our activities would become fundamentally different. Once we recognize, wow, this is really it's not just kind of something nice, moral to have, but it's actually a risk that we as a country are exposed to. We believe it takes about $100 million. Now, is that a lot? I think actually not really. In France, there are 7,000 people working on GDP, just for France. That's a budget of about $700 million a year, And it's an important measure. It's an important measure. I'm not arguing that. We are 15 people right now. We're growing about at 50% a year. 15 people now, and 2 of the people, 1.5 actually, are dedicated to look at the national accounts for 150 countries. Ridiculous. And we use data from the United Nations and all that, so that's kind of some pre-work that has been done by others. But it would take so little, and what would it how much investment would we have to turn around? We looked at, and that's something we want to do more. How much investment, how much of world GDP would we start to have to invest to kind of bend the curve? Like the Millennium Development Goals, I don't know if you're familiar with those. People say about 0.7% of world GDP would need to be invested to make them happen. Now, this probably takes a little bit more because it's more comprehensive than Millennium Development Goals. We think between 2 and 10% of something. So it's in the $5 trillion range a year of investments. And I call them investments because they're not lost money. They actually will generate more benefits than they cost. Just we have to find structures that some of the benefits go back to the investors. So it could be private and public investments. So with $100 million of investment to establish this in the world, which doesn't seem that much, it's less than a military airplane, we hope to catalyze $5 trillion worth of investments a year into the right direction. That's a pretty high return on investment per dollar. Now, okay, perhaps our probability of succeeding may be 10%. I hope actually higher. But even if at that discount of just 10% of that ratio, still huge impact that you can have by just bringing the information to people's attention. And I think that's why Google is interesting for us, because you are working on information, making information accessible, interesting, and not just as a moral argument, but so people can start to play with it and start to see, why is it relevant to themselves? I sometimes use an experiment in lecture. I bring a balloon, and I blow a balloon and say, is bigger always better? And blow it up. Oh, you hooray, nothing has happened so far. Shouldn't we have some more chocolate? And the interesting part is actually, people who sit close, they sit there with grim faces, and think, oh my God, what's happening? And people in the back, they kind of just laugh their heads off, And the interesting part, so if this is, everybody has exactly the same information. Everybody has exactly the same information, but the relevance of the same information is different to people. So it's not about information per se, it's to make the information relevant to people. And I think what our friend Crutcher said, it has to link to people's self-interest directly. They have to see themselves in there and say, wow, this makes really sense for me. This makes my life safer. In Melbourne, for example, they had huge water crises. Still have, because it's a very dry area, growing city. And 20 years ago, people felt when they used more water, they had a happier life. Big swimming pools, long showers, washing their car, gardening, beautiful, and then just hearing the water splatter. What could have been nicer, And now they realize, wow, this is actually undermining our collective security. Now they have an indicator that says how many percentage points are left behind the dam. 37%. 2 weeks ago it was 36%. Wow, we're better off. So collectively, when they see we have more saved, we are better off. And then the neighbor is washing their cars. You're undermining my future. Using less, I'm better off. Same with saving. Rather than spending the money stupidly, I have it in the bank. I'm better off. I'm safer. The same way, I think we can reprogram our understanding. It's not reprogramming our genetic makeup. We work with the people as they are. That's what we have genetically, biologically available. But we say, I'm better off as a nation when we don't have this risk exposure. We are safer as a nation, or we are safer as a city if we can be efficient. I'm safer with my investment because my house will not depend so much on resources that are kind of vanishing. Like the Petroleum Institute, I don't know if you saw this big advertisement, balanced energy. Did you see that big advertisement? It said, with all the oil undiscovered on the public lands. We use, by 2050, we'll be using 28 million barrels a day in the United States. Under the public land, there are 30 billion barrels of oil to be pumped out, so 1,000 times more. So they say, this would be enough to power 15 million cars and 30 million houses for 30 years. Now, if you just do the calculations, actually just 1,000 times more per day, so that's 3 years worth of oil supply. So, hooray, balanced energy. We're just going to go on for 3 years, exactly as we did before, and then what? That's all the oil we have under public lands, which span, I don't know how many percentage points of the whole United States. Anyhow, so I don't know where I got on this sidetrack, but one thing we want, according to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed by 170 heads of states, including George Bush Sr. in '92, is to say we want to maintain the atmospheric concentration constant in the long run. Essentially, they signed a bathtub eventually will overflow if you continue to fill it up. So we shouldn't fill it up continuously. So essentially, this is what we say as a service, what we want. We think the next generation is as good off if they don't have a higher concentration as we had. So otherwise, we leave them with more of a debt. So that's a service that we want collectively. We said that codified, so to say. Now, what does that mean? Either we can sequester the CO2 with technology, or we say, no, let nature handle this. How much nature do we need to provide this service? So for all the part that we don't take responsibility ourselves to sequester it, then that's released to nature and say, okay, let nature handle that. So how much nature, how much of the biosphere's capacity is available to sequester CO2? How much actually is needed compared to how much we put in the atmosphere? So we see as a balance, say, if we just say nature should take care of it, that's how much capacity would be set aside. And then rather than harvesting timber, we need to leave it aside for sequestering CO2 because they are in competition. Either you can harvest the timber or we can leave the area for CO2 accumulation. So just to show, nature doesn't have enough service capacity to provide the service that we say we want. And then you can compare that to say, okay, when we do biomass, how much area is necessary? Some biomass applications actually lead to larger footprints even than fossil fuel because they're so inefficient. Others are very efficient. So you start to kind of see what energy options, how are they interplaying? Are we just shifting the footprint or are we moving it? So in some ways, we don't advocate, we don't say sequestration is a solution, we just say, essentially, according to the research question, we say the limiting factor of the planet is its regenerative capacity. How much is available? How much do we actually use? So it's not hypothetical. It's actually comparing actual demand with actual supply in every year. Is that a? Yeah, but it's a good question. And there's actually a whole research paper if you want more details on how it's calculated, how it links to IPCC calculation and all that. I'm happy to send that to you. And I also passed around this yellow sheet if you're interested in our newsletters, which come out every 2 seconds. No, every 2 months or so. Then just put it on your email and then you get updated. Yes?
Yeah, if there are no more questions, because I already asked one question. So I was wondering, like you talked about trade-offs between the long term and the short term.
Yes.
Right? I was wondering if there is any way in which you can make something profitable in the short term as well as the long term, so you don't even have to convince people, like, this is in your self-interest 2 years later, or maybe like in the short term, meaning like 6 months or something, right? So, and like
I think some of these possibilities absolutely exist, and some of them you need to put in more investments first. For example, like green buildings, maybe a little bit more expensive at the beginning, but then operational costs are way lower. So by doing good accounting and, for example, putting operational expenses and construction expenses in one pot, you can see the benefit earlier on, or through finance mechanisms where you can finance the hump. It will be possible to kind of, through finance mechanisms, achieve this outcome. Absolutely. I mean, these are the innovations that are needed.
Like, you had mentioned like waste, using waste productively. Like, I mean, I think there are like projects for generating energy out of waste.
Absolutely.
Which is like beneficial both in the short and the long term.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And then there may be some things that don't produce enough benefits to the user. I mean, we are driven by externalities, and some people say externalities is actually the best cost-saving mechanism existing. And if you take the Stern report, I don't know if you've seen the Stern report from the UK. Essentially, they say each ton of carbon emitted now has a cost of $80. And then you have voluntary markets. So most of the CO2 emitted now has 0 cost. And then there's some voluntary market. I don't know how many percentage point of the overall CO2 emissions from fossil fuel. That is traded at between $8 and $12. So even in these markets, it's tenfold less than the actual costs. So even in the best case of the voluntary market, it's still a distortion of factor 10 times more externalities. And the externalities should be far smaller than the price, 10 times bigger than the price itself. So there are misincentives now, massive misincentives that subsidize bad behavior in terms of climate or sustainability. So I don't think the structure right now is fully there that all the sustainability projects will win out on their own. But some are, and we need to do them symbolically and to show the technological advances that are possible, absolutely. So that's why we think we also need a social contract then. But we need to show that it's feasible, technically feasible, and that already now economically interesting to get people's attention, absolutely. Very good question. Yeah. So in that, I mean, just perhaps as a summary, I don't know how much more time you have, but we are interested in looking, like building relationships also with you, particularly how to display this data in exciting ways. And Google Earth is an excellent example, could be populated with these kind of informations. Scenario calculators where people can play with these data and make the graphs dynamic and interesting. If that's of interest to you or you'd like to help us in making our website much more interesting, we'd love that support. And other ways that you see fit. Because as I said, I think it's a very small, $100 million is a very small investment in some ways. And that we could leverage so much investment into the right direction. Overshoot is the biggest game in town, I think. We're here to win it. So people say, are you a pessimist or an optimist? And I would say, once you play, if you ask a football player, are you an optimist or pessimist? They just say, I'm just playing. So we're trying to play as hard as we can. And I think it's a great probability. We see the uptake so fast in the world that actually we can get this on people's agenda. It's such an easy concept. I remember I talked with my grandfather 20 years ago, not because I was particularly smart, but just my grandfather kind of said about oil, don't worry about oil. We always will have 30 or 40 years worth of oil on the ground. And as a kid, I say, how is that possible? I mean, there's a limited amount. Isn't there less and less and less and less, So we kind of have these concepts. Oh, we can invent our way out of resources. They don't really exist, whatever. And now we see, oh my God, I don't know if you're familiar with limits to growth. Are you familiar with limits to growth as computer geeks? You are, obviously. Go back to that book, 1972. They're just rough, standard runs, whatever. And they actually didn't say the world will come to an end, as people claimed they did. They showed curves and say, in the mid of the 21st century, there will be a downturn if we just stay on the same track. Now, if you look at all the climate research, if you look at these curves that we showed here, if you looked at the oil peak curves, even from Shell, they all show the same kind of downturns in the same time range. So it's kind of interesting how these simple truths we haven't been able to communicate well, wanting to accept. And I think it's a psychological question. How can we make it accessible? That's, I think, why Google is so beautiful in some ways. Make information attractive and interesting so people can explore it themselves rather than hitting people with the moral stick. I'm a moralist by birth. I like to hit people and say, you're wrong. But somehow it's not so inviting. And so providing information in accessible ways, that's really, I think, key to the transformation. And so that's why I'm excited to be here. So thank you very, very, very much. And look forward to your email conversations. And come and visit us in Oakland. We're close by. Thank you.